So firstly, I just want to let you guys know that I do have a little bit of a cold at the moment, which is currently sitting here like right at the top of my chest. So if there's any weird like voice or throat stuff going on in this video, I apologize, but I just really wanted to get a whole bunch of videos filmed today and I'm too impatient to wait for the cold to ease off. But this is obviously going to be my October wrap up, which as you guys know is where I give all of my thoughts on all of the books that I read in October. Now during the month of October, I thought I was doing real well. I thought I was flying through books, and in my defense I did read 7 books total, but a lot of them were very short. So in terms of page count, which is what I actually take notice of more than like the amount of books that I read, it's worse than September, which I didn't actually think was possible after I failed my own readathon. I did for the most part try to keep on theme with like spooky reads. I know in my October wrap up I said I wanted to mood read a bit, and I did, and I really enjoyed myself. So I think out of these 7 books I read, there's only one that isn't particularly spooky. But getting into those stats, in the month of October I read a total of 2,283 pages, which broke down to an average of 74 pages per day. In terms of the star ratings, it was a very average month. I had 3 3-star reads and 4 4-stars, breaking down to an average of 3.6, which is actually only slightly below like my total average rating. For the demographics, I read 2 young adult books and 5 adult. In terms of the formats, we had 5 standardly formatted novels, 1 novella and 1 comic. For the genres, a very mixed bag. We had 2 fantasy, 2 romance, 2 paranormal and 1 thriller. And for the places where I sourced these books from, 4 of them I have hauled in 2022 and 3 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2022. So getting into the books that I actually read, the first one was a little bit of a disappointment for me, and it was the 1 thriller that I read in October, which was The Butcher and the Wren by Elena Urquhart. This is like, it's a thriller, but it also feels very crimey, and it also has like some horror elements in there as well. But the reason why I wanted to read this is because the author Elena Urquhart is one of the co-hosts of my favorite podcast, which is Morbid. So I knew that I wanted to read this. I'm a little bit of a Morbid fangirl, I cannot lie, so I just wanted to support Elena. And sadly, this wasn't the best for me. And bear in mind when I give my thoughts on this, I don't really read thrillers, so my opinions on them aren't necessarily to be trusted because I'm so inexperienced. I'm just going in for the vibes, and I can't critically review thrillers. But this is a dual perspective book that is following a forensic pathologist and also a serial killer. So the chapters alternate between the 2 of them, and we're following the serial killer as he like hunts down his victims, which is where the horror elements come in, and the forensic pathologist is kind of like following along behind him, trying to catch him as he goes. So in terms of the way that this was formatted and the fact that we have a forensic pathologist, it reminded me of like TV shows like Bones or like Criminal Minds and things like that, which I have to say, like, I grew up watching those because my mum was obsessed with them, and because of that I just really don't like crime at all. So that straight off put me off in this one. I know I've seen a lot of people really creeped out by the horror elements of this. It didn't really do it for me. I didn't find it all that scary, and I didn't feel like we had enough of a variety between the 2 perspectives, and that does make sense because it is made clear multiple times throughout this book that like both of these people are very clinically minded people. They're very logically minded, and they're driven by like facts and evidence as opposed to emotion. The issue that I had with that is that it felt like kind of bad writing because the characters were kind of like pretty much the same, so the whole thing was like pretty flat. There was like a decent plot twist in here, I feel, but I don't feel like it was well grounded. There were multiple points throughout this book where we got like a little bit of information, and like on the surface level it seems fine, but if you think too hard about it, then there's a lot of plot holes and the whole thing like kind of falls apart. I don't think that it was the best thing I've ever read, but the pacing in here was pretty good. It kept me turning pages, and I finished this one pretty quickly, but sadly it is just a 3-star read for me. I then read a book y'all have been wanting me to read for a long time, which is Dark Lover by J.R. Ward, and guys, I really liked this. I was expecting not to love this because of how much love other people have for this series, and my track record with paranormal romance is spotty. You'll tell me to read a paranormal romance series because it's great, and I end up thinking that it's kind of like average at best. So I was kind of expecting the same from this one, but I gave it 4 stars, and I'm actually really like actively excited to continue with this series. So if you guys are unfamiliar with Dark Lover, it is the first book in the Black Dagger Brotherhood series, which is a like 20-ish book series at the minute, and I'm not sure it's finished, where each book follows a member of the Black Dagger Brotherhood, which is a group of vampire warriors. So I think the first handful of books follow the core vampires, and then it kind of like branches out a little bit as we get further into the series, because like I said, it's really long. So this one is following the king of the vampires called Wrath, who is visually impaired, and he is also a reluctant king because he doesn't feel like he can lead his people, and it's just responsibility that he doesn't want. Our main character in here is Beth, and she is actually the daughter of a different member of the Black Dagger Brotherhood, and her father asks Wrath to look after her because she's about to transition, which is a very dangerous time for a vampire. The law in here is kind of like you can believe that you're a human up until you reach a certain age, like in your 20s, and then you will start to make the transition into a vampire. So her father asks Wrath to look after her, to help her through the transition, and he automatically just does not want to do it up until Beth's father is killed, because the kind of ongoing plot throughout this series is a war between like these weird, creepy, undead almost vampire hunters and the Black Dagger Brotherhood and vampires themselves. So Beth's father's killed, and Wrath then decides to help her because her father meant a lot to him, and it was like kind of the last thing that he really said to Wrath. So Beth is actually estranged from her father. She has nothing to do with this world, like she doesn't know anything about vampires. So through her, as with a lot of like books and series like this, we learn more about the vampire world as she grows closer to Wrath. So I'm not the biggest fan of paranormal romance, as we've established, and I also don't typically love when we have a series where each book follows a different couple, but this, it was so good. Like you can tell that there is an expansive plot here. Like it was generally very focused on the romance, and in terms of like relationship dynamic, this was kind of along the lines of it was almost the classic kind of paranormal romance relationship dynamic that we see all the time, you know, very Bella and Edward, but there was just little things that were different about it. Beth actually had brain cells. I was shocked that Wrath was visually impaired, because that kind of representation is not something you usually see in a series like this, especially published in 2005. So I was really pleasantly surprised to see that representation in here, especially with a character in a central role. You can tell that we actually have a plot here that is going to expand with this war between the vampires and the vampire hunters. Something that I really loved about this is that it was multi-perspective, and the perspectives went outside of the main couple, and I fell in love with so many side characters in here. At the minute, I'm rooting for Butch, and I was rooting for Butch through this entire thing, which was incredibly disappointing because it's very clear from the start that this is going to be Wrath and Beth. However, I do have it on good authority that Butch does have his own book later down the line, and I am so hyped for that because, you know, I have to tell you, it is exhausting always rooting for the anti-hero, but I am going to do it regardless. I also expected this to be very dated, as a lot of paranormal romance from the early 2000s is. It is dated like very slightly, especially regarding the like terminology used for sex workers throughout here that we don't typically use in 2022. But overall, very pleasantly surprised, had a really good time, and I'm excited to carry on with the series. And this one was a gift from Jessica, so thank you very much to Jessica for that. I then had my 24-hour readathon with my patrons, and I wanted to succeed at this one, so I intentionally picked a couple of shorter things. And the first thing I completed was Buffy Volume 3, which is From Beneath You, and this one is the first part of the Buffy Angel Hellmouth event. I'm actually really sad because this series is now finished. I think there's like 4 or 5 volumes of Angel, there's 8 of Buffy, 1 Willow spin-off, and they're kind of done, and they're going on to like a different reiteration of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I have to say I'm really disappointed about because I do like this one. That being said, I don't really like the art style, but taking it back a notch, this is a reboot of the 90s TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which, I mean, y'all already know that I'm a big fan of that, but I just remembered I'm actually wearing a Buffy t-shirt underneath my hoodie. So yeah, I'm obsessed. And the more time goes on, especially because like 90s culture and stuff is like back in fashion right now, they're selling Buffy t-shirts everywhere and I'm snapping them up. I have 3 already and I'm not done. So anyway, yeah, 90s TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer is about this teenage girl who is destined to fight off the hordes of evil. Like, she's the vampire slayer, so vampires are the priority, but it also extends to like demons, witches, anything that's like supernatural and bad. So this is a modern reboot. I believe that it's set in 2019, so it pretty much just strips everything that's dated from the show, because there is like a little bit in there, brings it up to date, adds things like technology, the fashion's been updated, and it's just really good to see it like that, because something that I really love that the writers have done in here is kept the core personalities of the characters as portrayed by the actors in the show, and just kind of updated it. Now, that being said, I do feel like I was catfished by volume 1 of this. Number one, because Dan Mora was the artist and the art in volume 1 is stunning. And I also feel like now that the writers have got people hooked, they're taking more liberties with the plot, taking it in their own direction, which is fine. But the one reason why I adored volume 1 is because it was so true to the show, but also very refreshing, and I feel like we've lost all of that. I did give this one 3 stars. The story was alright. I do still enjoy the writing in here, but I actually actively despise the art style in here. Like, this is Willow and Xander. Why? And then to make matters worse, they include alternate covers in the back, and the alternate covers by different artists are actually gorgeous. So here we have Giles and Joyce from the Band Candy episode of the show. Look at that. And then the art in the comic is a bunch of gremlins, and I just can't cope. So yeah, the storyline is going in places that I don't especially love. The art is tragic. I do believe that they change artists at some point throughout here, so I'm just kind of waiting for that, but this has definitely like gone downhill for me pretty rapidly. I then finished up Lotus by Jennifer Hartman, which was a gift from Vish, so thank you very much to Vish for that. This one is a contemporary romance, but it has a thriller twist. Everything that Jennifer Hartman writes, I believe, is quite dark, or a little bit darker than typical romance. The most notable one is Still Beating, which is a serial killer romance, and this is different but in like kind of a similar vein. And I think I know how the first, like how Still Beating is connected to this now, so I'm really excited to read Still Beating eventually. But this is following Oliver and I can't remember, Sydney I think is her name, but Oliver was kidnapped when I think he was about 8 years old, and he was kept in this underground bunker and told that the world had ended and it wasn't safe to live above ground anymore. So he's lived in captivity peacefully for 22 years. I think he's 30 when he gets out, and this is about him getting out, kind of being rehabilitated, and also reconnecting with the girl who lives next door that was his best friend when he was a child. So I gave this one 3 stars. I did really like it, and I loved the darker twist on it with this extra plot line that had like the kidnapping and stuff in it. Content warnings in here for kidnapping, home invasion, sexual assault, and pedophilia, so it does deal with like quite a few dark topics, and I actually really enjoyed that. I liked that extra element of suspense. I liked unraveling the mystery of kind of like what actually happened to Oliver. Something that I didn't love about this is that quite early on in the book, it kind of makes you think that that was just a catalyst for the story, and we're not really going to go back and investigate like who kidnapped Oliver and why. Safe to say that that does come back at some point, but I feel like when I hit that dip where that plotline kind of disappeared, my interest also dipped, because in terms of the romance, this is like a friends to lovers story, but it's very wholesome, and super wholesome romances are not for me. I enjoyed that we had the extra conflict because of all of this past trauma, and also the unresolved business that these two people had with each other, because Oliver just disappeared from Sydney's life when she was a child, and she kind of, even as a child, she thought that she had a future with him in it always, no matter like what shape that future took. So I did appreciate all of that, but them as a couple, like the dynamics between them, it's just so wholesome throughout here that it just completely lost my interest. I like a lot of angst, and you could say, what more angst could you need than kidnapping and trauma? And you have a point, but I need a bit of sarcasm and a bit of banter, and I just didn't feel like it was delivering on that front. So yeah, 3 stars. Really excited to read more from Jennifer Hartman. Liked the plot, liked the extra spice that the kidnapping plotline gave this. The romance was just a bit too wholesome for me though. My favorite book of the month, I think, is very surprising because it is The Dare by Harley LaRue, which is a very short romance novella. It is 145 pages, and it is, see, this is why I liked it so much more straight away. It is a smutty novella about the popular girl and the misfit boy, which is a dynamic that I just love. But it's set like a couple of years after these characters have left high school, and one of the people from their like year at school is throwing this massive Halloween party, but it's the popular crowd that are going. So when our main character Jessica arrives, she's very surprised to see the school misfit Manson there. She's a little bit worried because she bullied him for a long time. So very quickly they start playing a game of drink or dare, which is like beer pong, but some of the cups have dares on them, and it very quickly becomes apparent that Manson's goal in this game is to humiliate Jessica as much as possible, and then it just essentially devolves into smut at some point, which I wasn't mad about. So Harley LaRue is really good for providing a full list of kinks on the Goodreads page for all of their books. So I would definitely recommend that you check those out because their books are very, very kinky. So this one deals a lot with BDSM, humiliation and degradation, also like restraint and that kind of stuff. That is not everything though, so please do check the kinks if there's anything you're a little bit wary about. But I had a great time, and you know, degradation, humiliation, not my thing, but it is now because I really enjoyed this. I would actually say as well that Harley LaRue is now up there for me with Katie Robert as the best smut that I've ever read, because it is very rare for me to be able to read my porn without a plot, but there's something about Katie Robert and Harley LaRue that does it for me. Like, their smut is so good that I'm not overly bothered if the plot isn't really there. So definitely would recommend Harley LaRue in general. If you're a fan of fantasy romance, paranormal romance, I've also just recommended Harley LaRue in my spooky season fan row video. I definitely want to read more, and I'm becoming a very fast fan of this author. So thank you very much to Sophie who gifted this to me. You were right, this was definitely up my alley. I then read a book that I gave 4 stars to but have sadly already forgotten most of it, which I did think was going to be the case, and that is Gallant by V. Schwab. So this one is a young adult fantasy, but it's like a horror fantasy, and I have a rocky track record with V. Schwab. I love some of her books. I find some of them to be really lackluster, and this one is kind of hovering in the middle because in the moment I enjoyed it, but I don't find there to be anything particularly memorable about this one. So this one is following 16-year-old Olivia Pryor, who goes to this school for girls. I think she thinks she's an orphan, which she is, but she gets a letter from her uncle welcoming her to the family estate Gallant. So she arrives there and finds out that her uncle's actually dead, and the only living family member she has is this cousin who very much just wants her to leave, and it becomes very apparent that there's something unsettling and a little bit sinister going on in the grounds of Gallant. So Olivia, being Olivia, just wants to stick around. She wants a home. Like, it's not the best home, but it's better than any home that she's ever had. So she wants to stick around and help out and like share her cousin's burden because it's quite obvious there's something going on. It's established at the very beginning that there are like ghouls and ghosts in here as well. So I do think that this is a very good spooky season read, and I do think that V. Schwab very well captured the atmosphere of this and the kind of like spooky, eerie grounds of Gallant. And I think my problem with this is I didn't like the second half of it. Like, when we find out what is going on at Gallant and that starts to get explored, that was where I kind of lost my interest and stopped paying as much attention. V. Schwab is a very difficult author for me to talk about because I do still continue to buy and read her books, because her books are either 5 stars or 3 stars for me. I love Vicious and Vengeful, I love Addie LaRue, and everything else is pretty much average, sadly, including Gallant. So she's not a favourite author, she's not an author I would recommend or an author that represents me, but the books of hers that I like, I absolutely adore, and they're like my favourite books of all time, which is very frustrating because I don't want to keep investing money in an author that I find average, but her hits are so good. I do think that there is a V. Schwab book for everyone, and I think that's the issue. Like, she's not consistent enough for me. Like, I like that she goes through all of these different genres, but because she lacks consistency, I cannot rely on her books to be enjoyable ones for me. This one does read like young YA as well. The main character is 16, but she feels about 12 within the narration of this, and it is a very quick read. I read this in pretty much, I think, 2 sittings. And then I read Gallant so long ago that I can't believe that the next book is my final book that I read in the month, and also kind of tied for my favourite with The Dare, but that is The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington, which is the first book in the Lycanius trilogy. So you can see with the size of this why my pace slowed down a lot towards the end of October, but this one is a book that I've been excited to read for a long time, and I do have to say it didn't disappoint. I had a really good time with this one, and for like a epic high fantasy, it was pretty pacey. Like, it took me a week to read it, but the pace throughout was decent. Like, it wasn't a challenge in high fantasy to read. I hate describing epic fantasy for the first time until I've got my spiel down, because I have to think about what to include in the synopsis. But in this, we are following, I can't remember anybody's name, we are following a young man called Davian. This world used to be ruled by augurs, which are people who have like very powerful magical abilities, or like they're thought to be godlike abilities. And I think around 20 years before the main storyline, the augurs were toppled, normal people came into power, and they killed off all of the augurs, but they kept the gifted alive. Still not too sure about the relationship between Augurs and gifted, but gifted are essentially people with a lesser magical power than Augurs. Augurs can like mentally manipulate people. Gifted can manipulate the physical world. Like they use something called essence that manifests itself in like a physical ability, whether that's elemental or like moving objects and that kind of thing. So when these normal regular people came into power, they enslaved the gifted and they are restrained by a set of tenets. So they're not allowed to use their magic in a way that would hurt anybody, including self-defense. They can only go places with the permission of like the administration, which is the governing body that's been put in place to kind of control them. And Davian is finding himself very frustrated by these rules in this life that has been imposed on him as the result of a war that didn't even happen in his lifetime. Davian himself also has a unique ability because his power is not manifesting like the rest of the gifted. He has the ability to tell whether people are lying or telling the truth, and he has no like physical manifestation of power at all. So this is something that's causing him a lot of anxiety because the trials are coming up, and if you fail the trials, you get your power stripped and you become something that's called a shadowed, which is essentially the lowest of the low. Like people will spit on you when you walk past if you're a shadowed. So it's obviously something that Davian doesn't want. So one day he is approached by an elder who is like a fully trained gifted, and the elder tells Davian that he knows that he's actually an Augur, and he gives him this artifact and tells him to take it to the north where there is this big magical barrier that's keeping a whole ton of monsters at bay. However, it is starting to weaken and the elder knows how to fix it. Like the elders and the gifted know how to fix it, but they need an Augur's ability. So Davian goes off on this quest with his friend, heading north to repair this magical barrier, and of course a lot of things happen along the way to kind of divert him from his task. So this gets compared to Sanderson a lot, and I do get it. It has a lot of plot similarities. I'm not going to say what, and it is kind of, it's vague. It's not like a rip-off or anything like that. It's only if you really think about it and connect the dots, but it does have like some similarities to Mistborn in kind of some, I want to say some like character elements. In terms of the writing, I get why it's compared to Sanderson, because something that I love about Sanderson is that he is a very accessible fantasy writer. His worlds are very complex, so are his magic systems and also his plots, but I feel like the way that he delivers them is very kind of straightforward, and I do feel the same about this. It has a very accessible writing style. Nothing is too difficult to understand, but I would definitely say that where this differs from Sanderson is that the plot of this is kind of predictable. There was not, I think there was one thing that I didn't predict in this, and I was along the right lines. I just didn't get like the specifics of this plot twist, but it uses like a lot of common fantasy tropes that we've seen before. Right at the beginning, we're introduced to a character who very clearly has an alter ego, and as soon as it was mentioned that that guy had a secret, I knew exactly what kind of character it was, like what his position was in this world, because it's just something we've seen 10,000 times before. That being said, as somebody who loves things like Easter egg hunting and looking for like minute clues within fantasy, that never necessarily detracts from my enjoyment of a book, and I still really loved this despite that. It's just kind of like a forewarning. If you have read a lot of fantasy, a lot of this will be predictable to you. So if you're going into this hearing it compared to Sanderson, don't expect the intricacy of plot and epic plot twist that Sanderson delivers, because this just does not have that. But it was still a really great time. We have a whole ton of morally grey characters in here, and once again, yes, it is exhausting always rooting for the anti-hero, because my favourite character in this book is Caden, and that's all I'm gonna say. Y'all know why. If you read this, you knew you could see a mile off. You knew that I would love him. Something else that I really enjoyed about this is that not the teenage main cast, but the kind of the people above them, the people who are slightly older, no matter what their position, none of them are trustworthy. It is very clear that everybody kind of has their own agenda, and it really kept me on my toes that I felt like I couldn't trust anybody, because I didn't necessarily think that they were lying per se, but there's a lot of instances in here of like people withholding the truth. So like, who is the good guy? I don't even know which side is good in here, because you would assume it's the one that your main characters are on, but is it? Because you can't trust any of the like older people giving you any information. There's a lot of oppression within this world. We have some grey morality within the characters that makes you think like, who are the good guys in here? Who is trustworthy? Is anybody telling me the truth? And that is definitely, I would say, one of my favorite elements of this. The only thing that just like had me rolling my eyes in here is the way that the adults in this world trust the teenage main characters. I can't remember how old these characters are, but they are all training to be like elder gifted, so they're youngish. I would say that they're all younger than 20, like the 3 main teenagers. The way that they are taken in by adults, and the adults will say, this is the situation, this is what's going on. One of them is even approached by somebody who's like super high in the government, and he just spills all of the government secrets, and he's like, so this is this and this is this and this is what we're gonna do, but you can't tell anyone because it's top secret, and like we could all die if anyone finds out. But they're just kind of giving the information to this group of teenagers, which was a little bit like unbelievable and fell into, I just don't expect to see it in adult fantasy really. I feel like you tend to have more of like a natural progression and the age up of characters in adult fantasy. But aside from that, I really loved it, and based on the final plot twist and where this left off, I'm really excited to get into the second book. I have actually already bought it, and it isn't on my official TBR from November. If I can squeeze it in there anywhere, you can bet that I'm gonna do it, because I had such a good time with this first book. I did also start, let me just grab it. Brie has actually destroyed this. She spilled my cup of coffee, she knocked my cup of coffee, and it just soaked my book. But I did start Pestilence by Laura Thalassa in October as well. I was torn about whether to include this because I did blast through like 200 pages of this on the 1st of November, but I have decided that I'm going to end up saving this for my November wrap up. Just note that I spent the final week of October not reading very much, but this is the book that I was reading. So yeah, part of this was read in October, and if you want to see my thoughts on this ahead of next month's wrap up, or this month's wrap up, I guess, I have just posted the vlog for it, so you can go ahead and check that out. So there you have it. That is everything that I read in the month of October. Some very good spooky season reads. Not as much like horror, because I do have a little bit of horror and I did want to squeeze one in, but I kind of ran out of time. I expected to finish Pestilence quicker and managed to squeeze something else in, which just like didn't really happen. I'm getting more and more congested as this video goes on. But down in my comments, please let me know what you guys read in October. What was your favorite book of October? Did you read a lot of spooky season reads? Answer all of the questions down in my comments. And also, I never do this, and I feel like I should because everybody else does. If you made it to the end of this video, please leave a little Halloween like jack-o'-lantern emoji down in my comments if you have nothing else that you would like to say. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.